The usual interpretation of verse 1 is that the one who is weak in faith is someone who doesn't understand the law has been done away with, and now you're able to do all the things that the law said you couldn't do before. Not all of them, of course, because nobody really believes that you're free to commit murder or commit adultery or whatever. But just the things that usually when people say this, they mean things that are distinctively Jewish: keeping the Sabbath day, eating kosher, um, wearing tzitzit on your clothes, all those kinds of things. And this is what most people believe this is talking about. The one who is weak in faith thinks he has to do more stuff in order to be pleasing to God. And the one who is strong in faith believes that he doesn't have to do anything, that he doesn't have to keep the Sabbath. He doesn't have to avoid eating pork or bugs or whatever. But is that really what is being talked about here? Anybody want to offer an opinion before we really get into it? And by getting into it, I don't mean quarreling over opinions.
I think it may be referring to those that are new to the faith, because they bring part of the world into the faith, and they have to contest with that, and they have to struggle with that. I have seen many a church that attempts to throw people that have just found the Lord into positions of leadership. And I think that to be unwise. I think there's a concept of eldership that has to do with age. I would equate it to that, or at least part of it.
Okay, good.
It seems like the word faith is a key word here. We tend to think of faith as something you do mostly in your mind, but when you look at the faith chapter Hebrews 11, where it talks about all these great men of faith, they're all commended for doing things, not just thinking things.
Yep, very true. Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about the concept of faith versus faithfulness, or intellectual assent to a fact, or trust in somebody, and loyalty to that person, and how all of these things relate to the concept of faith. And they all play into it. They're all part of the idea. But yeah, the biblical idea of faith is a lot more than just believing that something is true. It is believing that someone is true and then acting on that belief and being true in return.
That Syrophoenician woman that went to Yeshua for healing for a daughter, would that be considered someone that's weak in faith, who didn't know anything about the entire Hebrew belief system, but desired to get her daughter healed?
Who was the one where Yeshua said he had not seen such faith in all of Israel? Wasn't that a centurion? In Matthew 8:10, in this section of scripture, we have the centurion who comes to Yeshua and says, my servant is sick, and, he's going to die, or he's suffering terribly, and come heal him. And Yeshua says, sure, I'll come and heal him. And he says, no, you don't have to come, because you can just say the word and he will be healed. And Yeshua responds saying, truly, I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. And this is a centurion. He's not Jewish. I mean, he might know something of the culture and the commandments, but he didn't grow up in the synagogue and, learning Torah. But Yeshua says that he has more faith than anybody he's met in Israel. And then on the other hand, look at his disciples. When he tries to teach them about the leaven of the Pharisees, or about feeding the second multitude, and he says, "Oh, you of little faith, have you learned nothing?" And there's a contrast, I think. On one hand, somebody who doesn't know anything but still believes in who God is and what he can do, and that's a kind of faith that's very powerful. It's not a weak faith at all. And on the other hand, someone who knows lots of stuff but doesn't understand it or doesn't really believe it, and that's a weak faith. the concept of faith is a little bit fuzzy at times because it can mean different things in different contexts. And in this case, is Paul talking about someone who knows the scriptures and doesn't believe them? Or is he talking about somebody who is unfaithful, meaning he knows them, or whether he knows them or not, he's unfaithful to God because he doesn't believe God or doesn't do what God said to do?
I agree with what you're saying, but verse 1 references welcome him. So there is something to that particular phrase, which is implying to me that you are just entering into this community or belief system or whatnot. So I see what you're saying about faith having action, but that doesn't really address the welcome him part, you know?
Yeah, and that's a good observation, because that really that is important in understanding this verse.
In Romans 14:1, really, as you were mentioning, Jay, it's so contextual to what the whole chapter goes on to describe. And I would agree with, I think, what the other gentleman is saying, that this is really about a person who is perhaps just entering to starting to, keep the commandments, or, follow Shabbat or eat clean or whatever. In the context of that aspect, I think this person who's weak in faith needs to be still welcomed, but not get into quarrels over opinions. So that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Well, I think that all of these things in combination are very helpful at getting to the point of what Paul is saying, that this is about people who are new to the faith in general, maybe not always, but fairly, that's probably mostly what he's talking about. And he is talking about people who believe God's promises and in God's word. But it's not like he's talking about people who know the word and don't believe what God said. That's not the kind of lack of faith that he's talking about. He's talking about people who may not have confidence that they understand the word or know all the ins and outs and don't know exactly where the boundaries are. And so they're erring on the side of caution and saying, I don't want to screw up. So I don't want God to strike me with lightning or, whatever this God I've just discovered does. So I'm going to go way overboard trying to do the right thing. And so it's not even talking about somebody who is disobedient necessarily, but somebody who is fearful that God is going to strike them for doing the wrong thing, or just ignorant about what it is they're supposed to be doing. So since they don't understand the nuances of the commandments, they're putting up fences around fences. If you're not familiar with that term, it's a common way to describe all of the rabbinic rules that have been built up around the actual written commandments. So rather than risk potentially violating the Sabbath by creating an electrical circuit, they automate it all so that the elevator just goes up and down all day and opens the door on every floor so nobody has to accidentally push a button. And this is a fence around a fence. And not many people would probably say that pushing a button in an elevator is really breaking the commandment, but just to be sure, because maybe it is, we're just not going to push any buttons. And, setting up a specific distance, you can carry a key in your pocket, but you can't carry it in your hand. Rules like that. And it's just to make sure that you don't even get close to violating the commandment. And I really think that that's what Paul is talking about here.
Well, it's interesting. If somebody comes to the faith, there's usually an exuberance and oh man, I've experienced something that is incredible. I want to share it with everybody. And there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's a good thing. It probably is reminding those that have been in the faith for quite some time. Wow, that's what I should strive for. There's a sense of a purity to it, but there's a craziness to it as well. And trying to temper that and mold that that's a difficult thing.
Mhm.
It's just because you don't want to squash and basically discourage somebody in what they're truly experiencing, but you also want to bring them into proper understanding.
That really is exactly what Paul is talking about. And the most common interpretation of this chapter is that Paul is talking about the commandments and saying, God commanded to keep the weekly Sabbath. God commanded to eat only clean animals. And Paul is saying, only the people who are weak in faith, they still think they have to keep all these commandments. And people who are strong in faith, they know that, these commandments don't apply anymore, and we can eat whatever we want, and we can take a Sabbath or not take a Sabbath or take it on any day we want. That's the typical interpretation of this passage. I think that it's easy for people to believe that because they're not exposed to the actual controversies that were happening in Rome. But if you spend a few years in a Torah observant congregation, you will know exactly what Paul is talking about because you will see it with your own eyes. And it's got nothing to do with whether or not we should keep the Sabbath or whether or not we should keep clean. It's more about how do we do these things and where are the boundaries? Some of the crazy things that we see in Torah observant congregations, or pronomian is, I think, a more neutral word. I don't want to use the term Hebrew roots because it's loaded with so much baggage, but the baggage is really what I'm kind of talking about here. So maybe I should just use that term. People argue about, does the Sabbath begin at sunset, or does it begin at midnight, or does it begin at sunrise? Is the Sabbath counted from the new moon, or is it just a continuous cycle of 7 days? What is clean? Is duck clean or not? What about people actually argue about whether chicken is clean? And turkeys, and maybe a shark is clean because if you use a microscope, you can actually see something that looks like scales. So these arguments happen all the time within these communities because people are relearning the commandments that their ancestors forgot. And they are mixing with people who have been keeping the commandments for years or decades or even their whole lives, just like what was happening in Rome. We had the Jewish community who was temporarily exiled and then came back. And we have the Gentile believers who were, they weren't abandoned by the Jews because the emperor kicked them out, but they were left alone in Rome, mostly alone, trying to figure this stuff out on their own. And now the Jews are starting to come back. And the Gentiles, while in the absence of the Jewish believers, they had started developing their own culture and their own interpretation of the commandments. And now we've got these two cultures that are trying to fellowship together and experiencing conflict. And these new believers get so excited about the new things that they're finding, the new commandment all the time, a new concept, a new idea about God. And these things can be really exciting. I think just about everybody who crosses that line from being the typical Sunday Christian who believes that everything except the 10 Commandments have been done away with, over into a law-abiding, Torah-keeping believer, gets really excited for a period of time. They want to argue about everything. And it's not because they want to argue necessarily. Some people do, but it's because it's really important to get it right. And they feel like they've got to understand this, and everybody else has to understand it too, or you're all condemning yourselves by keeping the Sabbath wrong. And most of the things that we end up arguing about are things that God didn't really explain very well. Like, when does the month start? Outside of Torah keeping circles, who cares? Nobody knows. Nobody even thinks about it. But when you start keeping the commandments and you start trying to keep God's appointed times on the days that he said, well, then it becomes important. Does the new moon start at the conjunction? Is that where the month begins? Or does it start when you see the first sliver of the moon? Does it start when you see it where you live, or when two people see it in Jerusalem? Well, the Bible just doesn't say. It is totally silent about how do you determine when the month starts. So this is something that's a matter of opinion. We have to figure it out. Now, obviously, well, maybe not obviously if you haven't studied it, but God's appointed times are designed to be kept as a community. Everybody's supposed to be doing it on the same day. So if everybody decides in their own mind which day is the right way to do it, then we're not really doing it, because we're supposed to be doing it on the same day. And that will become important as we go a little bit further into this chapter. I'm just kind of giving a perspective of what's really happening here in Rome. And if you want to see it with your own eyes, find a Messianic Jewish or a Torah observant congregation in your area and go fellowship with them for a few years. After 3 or 4 years, I mean, you have to be patient, but after 3 or 4 years, you will get a really good feel for what Paul was talking about in this chapter.